Marcus Jefferson had always lived a quiet life after retiring from the Navy SEALs, settling back into the house his grandfather had built on the edge of town, a house that sat on land which had been in his family for 3 generations, land that carried memories of struggles and survival, of hard labor and deep pride. And though he had seen combat zones and hostile territories, he believed nothing could disturb the peace of this neighborhood where children rode bikes, neighbors waved across fences, and nights passed under the sound of crickets rather than gunfire. But peace, as Marcus knew from his years of service, is always fragile, always threatened by those who confuse power with control. And it wasn't long before that threat arrived in the form of people who claimed to represent a homeowners association, flashing badges that weren't real, handing out notices that smelled of intimidation rather than law, targeting Marcus first because they assumed, wrongly, that he was just another man living quietly on a patch of land, too valuable to be left in his hands. The first time they came, it was 2 men in suits too clean for manual work and smiles, too practiced to be genuine, holding papers that claimed Marcus was in violation of HOA rules. Rules that didn't even exist because this part of town had never been under an HOA. But they spoke with such confidence, such false authority, that neighbors whispered and some even paid bogus fines just to avoid trouble. But Marcus, with his years of training, with his sharpened instincts that could smell a setup from miles away, knew better. He let them talk. He let them play their little game, but inside, he was already mapping their strategy, studying their behavior, watching the way their eyes darted when pressed for specifics, the way their tone sharpened when their authority was questioned. And though he was polite, though he dismissed them with the calm of a man who had stared down real danger, he knew they would be back. Because people like this never stop until someone draws the line. And back they came, this time bolder, this time bringing more men, this time spreading notices around the neighborhood, warning of confiscations, threats of liens, fake legal jargon that preyed on fear. And when Marcus refused to pay, when Marcus refused to bend, they changed tactics, targeting what they thought was his weakness, his firearms. They claimed no one in the neighborhood was permitted to keep weapons on the property, waving counterfeit documents stamped with official-looking seals, telling him he had to surrender every gun in his possession or face consequences. They didn't know, of course, that Marcus Jefferson wasn't just some homeowner with a few hunting rifles. He was a decorated Navy SEAL, a man who had handled weapons with precision under fire, a man who had led missions where one wrong move meant death, a man who had earned the right to carry himself with confidence, not because of the tools in his home, but because of the discipline and responsibility that came with his service. He looked at them, calm and unshaken, and simply said, "You boys picked the wrong house." But the threats didn't stop, and neighbors grew restless, afraid that these so-called officials had more power than they actually did, and fear began to spread like a sickness, the kind of sickness Marcus recognized from combat zones where propaganda and intimidation broke stronger men than bullets ever could. Marcus decided then that enough was enough, that it was time to gather evidence, to track every move, to catch them in the act, because standing alone was one thing, but protecting his community was another, and he couldn't allow these predators to keep feeding on the fears of good people. He began recording encounters, collecting every fake notice, photographing license plates, documenting threats. He reached out quietly to a contact in the sheriff's office, a man who had served in the Marines and respected Marcus enough to take his concerns seriously, and together they built a case, waiting for the moment the fraudsters would push too far. That moment came one humid evening when the group arrived in force, 3 cars deep, stepping out with the arrogance of people convinced no one would stop them, their leader carrying a clipboard like a weapon, declaring loudly that Marcus was in violation of HOA, gun restrictions, and that his firearms would be confiscated immediately. Neighbors peeked through blinds, some whispering prayers, others shaking with anger, but none daring to intervene, because fear still held its grip. The men marched up the driveway, but Marcus was waiting on the porch. His posture relaxed, his hands visible, his voice steady as he said, "Before you step onto this porch, you should know something about the man you're dealing with." They laughed, dismissive, used to scaring people into silence. But Marcus didn't flinch, didn't waver. He recounted his years as a SEAL, the operations he had led, the vows he had sworn to defend the Constitution, and then, with perfect timing, squad cars rolled into the street, lights flashing, doors slamming as deputies stepped out, weapons holstered but presence commanding. The HOA fraudsters froze, caught in the act, their fake badges suddenly meaningless under real authority. And as one deputy read them their rights, Marcus locked eyes with their leader and said quietly, "You thought you could intimidate a veteran into surrendering his rights? You thought wrong." The arrest was swift, but the effect was lasting. Neighbors pouring out of their homes now, voices rising not in fear, but in relief, in gratitude, in the dawning realization that they had allowed themselves to be bullied for too long. Mrs. Alvarez, who had once cried over bogus fines, lifted her chin and said, "We should have stood up sooner." Marcus didn't gloat, didn't bask in victory, but he told her and everyone else, "You stood tonight. That's what matters. Fear is a chain, but chains break the moment you decide you're done carrying them." The sheriff promised a full investigation, and already the fake notices and threats were being collected as evidence. But Marcus knew the true victory wasn't in the arrests. It was in the shift he saw in his neighbors, in the way Jacob now held his child with pride rather than worry, in the way Mrs. Alvarez no longer wrung her hands, in the way conversations sparked between houses that had once stood silent under fear. Strength had returned, and with it, the kind of unity that predators could never break. As the night deepened and the last cruiser disappeared, Marcus sat back on his porch, the quiet returning. But before he went inside, he spoke once more, his words carrying across the street, meant not just for those who had lived the fear, but for anyone who might hear their story someday. Don't let anyone tell you your home isn't yours. Don't let fake uniforms or false authority trick you into silence. Stand up, speak out, and protect what's right. Because the moment you give up your ground, you've lost more than property. You've lost your freedom. And freedom is worth fighting for every time. And so the story of Marcus Jefferson and the night the fake HOA officers tried to confiscate his guns spread beyond the neighborhood, told at dinner tables, retold online, whispered with awe and pride, until it became more than an incident. It became a lesson, a warning and a call to action, not just for that street, not just for that town, but for anyone who has ever been cornered by those who abuse power. Stand together, protect your ground, and never let fear dictate your story. Because real authority belongs to the people who refuse to surrender their dignity. And dignity, once defended, lights the path for everyone who follows. If this happened to me, I would do the same. What would you do? Be sure to tell me in the comments. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel so that more HOA stories can reach you.